What if I told you that the racial wealth gap, police killings, incarceration rates, and homeownership disparities the Black Panthers fought against in the 1960s have all gotten measurably worse by 2025? I spent 6 months analyzing current data and the numbers are staggering. But here's what's really fascinating. The community programs they created back then are being replicated by today's activists who don't even realize they're following the Panther playbook. The FBI's COINTELPRO declassification revealed that 230 full-time agents surveilled Panthers. Yet today's digital tracking follows activists through their smartphones in ways that would have amazed J. Edgar Hoover. To understand how we got here, we need to examine what the Panthers actually demanded and where America stands on those issues today. The post-civil rights promise that never came. The Black Panthers formed their organization around 10 core demands in 1966. They wanted full employment for Black people, decent housing, quality education, an end to police brutality, and community control over institutions that served Black neighborhoods. They called for land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. Nearly 60 years later, every single economic indicator they fought to change has moved in the opposite direction. The wealth gap between Black and white families tells the story most clearly. The Federal Reserve's latest data shows median white family wealth at $250,400, while median Black family wealth sits at just $24,520. This means white families hold more than 10 times the wealth of Black families, a disparity that has grown substantially since the Panthers organized in Oakland. The numbers get worse when you examine homeownership rates. In 2021, about 38.6% of Black families own their homes compared to 70.2% of white families. After decades of fair housing legislation and civil rights enforcement, the homeownership gap has actually widened from where it stood when the Panthers demanded community control over housing development. Educational funding disparities persist despite court orders and reform efforts spanning 5 decades. School districts serving predominantly Black students receive thousands of dollars less per student than districts serving mostly white students. In some states, the gap exceeds $4,000 per student. The Panthers operated their own schools because they recognized that underfunded public education served as a tool of social control. Their Oakland Community School provided free breakfast, medical care, and advanced curriculum to students whose neighborhood schools lacked basic resources. Deindustrialization destroyed the economic foundation the Panthers hoped to build upon. Manufacturing jobs that paid middle-class wages without requiring college degrees disappeared from cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Oakland, where Panthers organized most actively. The tech industry boom created new wealth, but concentrated it among workers with advanced degrees and social connections that excluded most Black workers. Google, Apple, and Facebook employ workforces that are less than 5% Black despite locating their headquarters in areas with large Black populations. Predatory lending replaced redlining as the primary mechanism of economic extraction from Black communities. Subprime mortgages, payday loans, and rent-to-own schemes target Black neighborhoods with mathematical precision. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that Black borrowers are 3 times more likely to receive subprime auto loans even when they qualify for conventional financing. Check cashing businesses and payday lenders cluster in Black neighborhoods at rates 5 times higher than in white areas with similar income levels. Gentrification operates as a more sophisticated version of urban renewal, the government program that destroyed Black neighborhoods in the name of progress during the 1960s. Cities now use tax incentives, zoning changes, and infrastructure investment to attract higher-income residents to historically Black areas. The result displaces longtime residents just as effectively as bulldozers did 50 years ago. Washington, D.C. lost 40% of its Black population between 2000 and 2020. San Francisco's Black population dropped from 13% in 1970 to less than 3% today. Housing segregation levels remain virtually unchanged since the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. The Brookings Institution's analysis of 2020 census data shows that 81% of metropolitan areas became more segregated over the past decade. Algorithmic discrimination now enables housing discrimination at scale through targeted advertising and automated screening processes. Facebook's advertising system allows landlords to exclude Black users from seeing rental listings, a practice that would have amazed 1960s civil rights lawyers in its efficiency and scope. The gig economy promises flexibility, but delivers economic insecurity that disproportionately affects Black workers. Uber and Lyft drivers earn less than minimum wage after accounting for vehicle expenses. Amazon warehouse workers face injury rates twice the industry average. DoorDash and similar platforms classify workers as independent contractors to avoid providing health insurance or unemployment benefits. These jobs concentrate in Black neighborhoods because traditional employment remains scarce, creating a new form of economic exploitation that the Panthers would have immediately recognized. Financial technology now enables discrimination that operates faster and more comprehensively than anything the Panthers faced. Credit scoring algorithms incorporate data about shopping habits, social media activity, and residential location to determine access to loans, apartments, and jobs. These systems perpetuate racial bias while maintaining plausible deniability because they don't explicitly consider race. The result is systematic exclusion that operates automatically without requiring conscious prejudice from individual decision makers. Healthcare costs consume an average of 22% of Black family income compared to 16% for white families. Medical debt causes 530,000 personal bankruptcies annually, with Black families facing disproportionate impact due to lower average wealth and higher rates of chronic conditions linked to environmental racism. The Panthers operated free health clinics because they understood that healthcare access represented a form of community control that could build political power while meeting immediate needs. The concentration of wealth at the top makes the Panthers' anti-capitalist analysis seem moderate rather than radical. The richest 1% of Americans now control 35% of total wealth, while the bottom 50% hold just 2%. Jeff Bezos accumulates more wealth in a single day than the median Black family possesses in total. This level of inequality would have shocked even the Panthers, who criticized capitalism but could not have imagined its current form. But the Panthers face something beyond economic oppression that today's activists would find familiar. The FBI deployed unprecedented resources to monitor, infiltrate, and destroy their organization. What they discovered in government files decades later would pale in comparison to the surveillance capabilities that track modern movements through every digital interaction. Modern surveillance makes COINTELPRO look amateur. The FBI's 2023 document release revealed surveillance operations that assigned 230 full-time agents to monitor Panther activities across 25 cities. They intercepted mail, tapped phones, planted listening devices, and recruited informants at every organizational level. Today, police can track activists around the clock through phone location pings without deploying a single human agent. Data from mapping police violence shows law enforcement killed 1,365 people in 2022, underscoring the Panthers' warnings about unchecked state power that modern surveillance capabilities have amplified exponentially. Your smartphone broadcasts location data every few seconds to cell towers, creating permanent movement records that make traditional surveillance operations obsolete. The FBI needed court orders to tap Panther phone lines in 1968. Now they access call records, text messages, and internet activity through processes that require minimal judicial oversight. Social media platforms maintain detailed profiles on billions of users, including political affiliations and protest attendance. Twitter archives every tweet and tracks which accounts interact with activist content. Instagram's location tagging creates automatic protest activity maps. DeRay McKesson discovered his phone had been compromised during Ferguson protests when he received text messages intended for police surveillance teams. Patrice Cullors found listening devices in her Los Angeles home after organizing Black Lives Matter events. Alicia Garza received death threats that included private information only available through digital surveillance. These documented cases mirror COINTELPRO operations, but utilize technology that makes traditional methods seem primitive. Cell phone location tracking operates continuously without user awareness. Stingray devices mimic cell towers to intercept communications from phones in specific areas, letting police monitor entire protests without targeting individual participants. These devices collect data from every phone within range, creating mass surveillance capabilities that exceed anything the Panthers faced. Facial recognition systems scan protest crowds and match faces against government databases, containing driver's license photos, passport pictures, and mugshots. Amazon's recognition software identifies individuals in real-time video feeds and tracks their movements across multiple camera systems. The NYPD has used facial recognition to identify Black Lives Matter protesters from social media photos posted by other attendees. Chicago police have used similar technology to create lists of potential protest participants before demonstrations begin. Predictive policing algorithms analyze historical crime data, social media activity, and demographic information to identify individuals likely to engage in political activities. These systems assign risk scores to citizens based on online behavior, social connections, and residential location. Police departments use these scores to justify increased surveillance of specific individuals and communities. The algorithms often produce biased results that disproportionately target Black activists and communities of color. Research shows Black people face 2.9 times higher risk of police violence, validating the Panthers' analysis of systematic oppression that surveillance technology now amplifies. Modern warrants and secrecy orders are more extensive than anything available during the COINTELPRO era. Legal frameworks now authorize surveillance that the FBI could never have imagined in the 1960s. Corporate data brokers collect information from credit reports, utility bills, social media posts, and online purchases to create comprehensive citizen profiles. These companies sell access to government agencies including local police departments, federal law enforcement, and intelligence agencies. Modern activists have adopted counter-surveillance methods that build on techniques the Panthers developed. Encrypted messaging apps like Signal protect communications from government interception. Virtual private networks mask internet activity and location data. Burner phones prevent long-term tracking of activist communications. Security workshops teach activists to cover phone cameras, disable location services, and recognize surveillance indicators during meetings and protests. Artificial intelligence systems now automate the disruption tactics that COINTELPRO perform through human agents. Bot networks spread disinformation designed to create conflicts within activist organizations. Algorithmic amplification systems promote divisive content that undermines movement solidarity. Natural language processing analyzes activist communications to identify leadership structures and strategic plans. Machine learning algorithms predict which tactics will most effectively disrupt specific organizations based on their communication patterns and organizational structures. Social media platforms use artificial intelligence to identify and suppress activist content through automated content moderation systems. These algorithms often misclassify legitimate political speech as harassment or hate speech, resulting in post-removal and account suspensions. The systems operate with minimal human oversight and make decisions affecting millions of users daily. Appeal processes rarely reverse automated decisions, giving technology companies effective censorship power over political discourse. Government agencies now use artificial intelligence to process surveillance data at scales that would have required thousands of human analysts during the COINTELPRO era. Pattern recognition algorithms identify suspicious behavior in video feeds from thousands of cameras simultaneously. Network analysis software maps relationships between activists based on communication metadata and social media connections. These systems track the spread of political ideas through online communities and identify influential activists for targeted surveillance or disruption. The current surveillance apparatus makes the Panthers' security concerns seem almost quaint by comparison. Huey Newton's warnings about informants focused on individuals who might betray the organization through personal relationships or financial incentives. Today's activists face algorithmic systems that analyze their digital behavior for signs of dissent and automatically flag them for further surveillance. The Panthers worried about FBI agents infiltrating their meetings. Modern activists live under constant monitoring through devices they carry voluntarily and platforms they use daily. Corporate surveillance now rivals government capabilities and often exceeds them in scope and sophistication. Technology companies collect user behavior data that provides insights into political beliefs, social connections, and likely future actions. This information flows to government agencies through official partnerships and informal cooperation agreements. The result is a surveillance ecosystem that operates continuously and comprehensively, in ways that the Panthers' most security-conscious members could never have anticipated. But while the FBI was busy monitoring every Panther meeting and tapping every phone line, they missed something crucial happening in an Oakland church basement that would transform American society in ways they never imagined. The breakfast program blueprint that conquered America. The Black Panther Party launched their free breakfast program in January 1969 at an Oakland church, serving meals to local children before school started. Within 18 months, the program expanded to every major city where Panthers organized and fed approximately 20,000 children daily across the country. The program operated out of churches, community centers, and rented storefronts where volunteers prepared hot meals using donated ingredients and equipment. Panthers served eggs, bacon, grits, toast, orange juice, and milk to any child who showed up regardless of their family's political affiliations or ability to pay. Congressional representatives visited Panther breakfast sites during 1969 and witnessed the program's effectiveness firsthand. Representative John Kinnears from Michigan toured the Oakland program and praised its nutritional quality and community organization. The Nixon administration initially opposed expanding federal nutrition programs, but faced mounting pressure from both Democratic and Republican legislators who had observed Panther operations in their districts. The Department of Agriculture quietly began studying Panther breakfast methods and incorporated their serving procedures and nutritional guidelines into federal school meal standards. The Child Nutrition Act of 1966 had authorized federal breakfast programs, but provided minimal funding that reached fewer than 80,000 children nationwide by 1968. After Panthers demonstrated the program's feasibility and political popularity, the 1975 Child Nutrition Act expanded breakfast funding to all eligible schools. The federal school breakfast program now serves over 15 million children daily, and follows organizational structures that mirror Panther operations down to specific details like volunteer training procedures and community outreach methods. Modern mutual aid networks that emerged during COVID-19 lockdowns replicated Panther organizing strategies without conscious awareness of the historical connection. In Oakland, community fridges appeared at the exact same church sites where Panthers had operated food distribution programs 50 years earlier. Volunteers organized through social media to stock fridges with prepared meals, fresh produce, and pantry staples for anyone who needed food. The networks operated without means testing, government oversight, or bureaucratic requirements that characterize official assistance programs. Community health worker programs that operate in federally qualified health centers across the country trace their origins directly to Panther health clinics from the early 1970s. The Panthers trained community members to provide basic medical services, health education, and patient advocacy in neighborhoods where medical care was scarce or inaccessible. Current community health workers perform identical functions including blood pressure monitoring, diabetes education, medication adherence support, and healthcare navigation for patients with limited English proficiency or insurance coverage. Medical advocacy organizations like Health Care for the Homeless and the National Association of Community Health Workers explicitly reference Panther health programs as foundational models for their current operations. These groups train community members to address health disparities through direct service provision and political advocacy that challenges systemic barriers to healthcare access. The Panthers understood that health clinics could build political consciousness while meeting immediate needs, a strategy that contemporary health equity organizations continue to employ. Legal observer programs that monitor police behavior at protests directly evolved from Panther court watching and legal aid initiatives. The Panthers organized community members to attend court proceedings, document police misconduct, and provide legal support for arrested activists. Modern legal observers use smartphones instead of notebooks, but perform the same functions of witnessing police behavior, documenting civil rights violations, and connecting arrested protesters with legal representation. Copwatch organizations in cities like Berkeley, New York, and Los Angeles use training materials and operational procedures developed by Panther legal defense committees during the 1970s. These groups teach community members to safely observe and record police interactions while providing legal information to people stopped or arrested by law enforcement. The programs operate under the same community control philosophy that motivated Panther legal advocacy and maintain the same suspicious stance toward official police oversight mechanisms. Police abolition movements draw extensively on Panther analysis about the role of law enforcement in maintaining racial and economic oppression. Current organizers reference Panther writings about community self-defense and alternative conflict resolution when advocating for reducing police budgets and investing resources in community-controlled safety programs. The Panthers argued that police served as an occupying force in Black communities, language that contemporary abolitionists use when describing current law enforcement practices. Community land trusts and cooperative ownership initiatives reference Panther demands for community control over institutions that serve Black neighborhoods. The Panthers called for local ownership of businesses, schools, and housing as necessary components of Black liberation. Current land trust organizations use legal structures that implement community control through collective ownership and democratic governance of residential and commercial properties. Contemporary discussions about community care versus state welfare echo Panther critiques of government assistance programs that maintain dependency rather than building community power. The Panthers provided direct services while organizing recipients to understand their conditions as products of systemic oppression rather than individual failures. Current mutual aid advocates make identical arguments when distinguishing their work from traditional charity or government social services. The Panthers created operational blueprints for grassroots organizing that contemporary activists rediscover repeatedly, Because the underlying conditions of racial and economic oppression persist. Their survival programs demonstrated that community organizations could provide services more effectively than government agencies while building political consciousness and community power simultaneously. Modern mutual aid networks succeed by following these same organizational principles, even when participants remain unaware of their historical origins. But while activists today replicate Panther community programs with remarkable precision, the institutional violence that motivated those programs has intensified in ways that would have shocked even the Panthers' most militant members. The data on police behavior since the 1960s reveals patterns that validate their harshest criticisms of American law enforcement. Police violence statistics that prove the Panthers right. The Panthers called police an occupying army in black neighborhoods during the 1960s when comprehensive statistics on police violence didn't exist. Government agencies didn't systematically track officer-involved shootings or maintain databases on police misconduct. What data we have suggests police killed approximately 300 to 400 people annually during that decade, though record-keeping remained inconsistent and many departments simply didn't report fatal encounters. The Panthers had to rely on community reports, newspaper accounts, and their own documentation to build cases against police brutality. Campaign Zero's Mapping Police Violence database shows that law enforcement killed at least 1,365 people in 2024, making it the deadliest year since comprehensive tracking began in 2013. Police kill someone every 6.44 hours on average, a rate that would have staggered Panther organizers who documented individual cases of brutality in Oakland, Chicago, and New York. The Washington Post's database reveals that Black Americans face police violence at twice the rate of white Americans despite representing only 13% of the population. These numbers validate the Panthers' analysis about systematic police violence against Black communities. The Panthers demanded community control over police behavior through civilian oversight and accountability mechanisms. Body cameras emerged as a technological response to these demands, but evidence shows they fail to prevent police violence or ensure officer accountability. Studies indicate that body cameras have minimal impact on use of force rates, and officers routinely turn them off during critical incidents. The footage often gets withheld from public view through legal challenges and departmental policies that treat recordings as confidential investigative materials rather than public records. Less than 1% of police killings result in criminal charges, validating the Panthers' critiques of unaccountable policing. Police departments investigate their own officers and routinely conclude that deadly force was justified even in cases where victims posed no immediate threat. Grand juries decline to indict officers at rates that suggest prosecutorial bias, and judges dismiss cases on qualified immunity grounds before they reach trial. Black people are 2.9 times more likely to be killed by police than white people, demonstrating the racial targeting that Panthers identified as systematic oppression rather than isolated incidents. Police training programs have evolved to incorporate community relations rhetoric while maintaining tactical approaches that prioritize officer safety over civilian protection. The average recruit receives 58 hours of firearm training compared to 8 hours on de-escalation techniques. Warrior-style training programs teach officers to view communities as hostile territory where any interaction could prove fatal. These courses explicitly reject community policing philosophies and encourage officers to maintain tactical advantage through aggressive positioning and rapid escalation when they perceive threats. Contemporary protest policing tactics mirror the aggressive responses Panthers faced during demonstrations and community events. Police departments deploy less lethal weapons including pepper spray, rubber bullets, and sound cannons that cause serious injuries while technically avoiding fatalities. Kettling techniques trap protesters in confined areas to facilitate mass arrests. Undercover officers infiltrate demonstrations to provoke violence that justifies police crackdowns. These methods represent refined versions of tactics used against Panther rallies and community programs during the late 1960s. The Panthers advocated community self-defense as an alternative to relying on police protection that never materialized for Black neighborhoods. Modern police abolition movements build on this analysis by proposing community-controlled safety programs that address conflicts through mediation, mental health intervention, and resource provision rather than arrest and incarceration. These approaches recognize that police respond to symptoms of social problems without addressing underlying causes like poverty, housing instability, and lack of healthcare access. Current accountability mechanisms demonstrate the persistent failure of reform efforts that ignore the structural role police play in maintaining racial and economic inequality. Civilian oversight boards lack subpoena power and depend on police departments for investigative resources. Independent prosecutors assigned to police misconduct cases often maintain professional relationships with departments that compromise their independence. Body-worn camera footage frequently contradicts officer testimony, but rarely results in criminal charges or civil liability. Police spending continues expanding while community programs that address root causes of violence face budget cuts. Cities allocate between 20 and 45% of their general fund budgets to law enforcement while restricting funding for education, mental health services, job training, and housing assistance. This resource distribution pattern validates Panther arguments about police serving as tools of social control rather than community protection. The Panthers called for armed self-defense because they recognized that police violence represented systematic oppression rather than individual officer misconduct. Their analysis proves prophetic given current data showing that police violence occurs at consistent rates across departments regardless of training programs, oversight mechanisms, or reform initiatives. The problem lies in the fundamental role police play as enforcers of racial and economic inequality, rather than protectors of community safety. Modern discussions about police abolition echo Panther arguments about the impossibility of reforming institutions designed to maintain oppressive social relations. The Panthers understood that police violence would continue until communities gained control over their own safety and security. Current violence statistics suggest their most radical critiques about police, as occupying forces were actually moderate assessments of a system that has grown more militarized and less accountable than anything they faced during the 1960s. But police violence represented just one component of the systematic oppression the Panthers identified. They understood that arrests and shootings served as entry points into a broader system of social control that would expand far beyond what anyone imagined possible in the 1960s. The prison industrial complex the Panthers predicted. The Panthers predicted that America would use mass imprisonment as a tool of social control when prison populations seemed manageable by today's standards. In 1972, American prisons held approximately 200,000 people, with an imprisonment rate of 93 per 100,000 residents. The Panthers understood that the criminal justice system served as a mechanism for maintaining racial oppression rather than promoting public safety. Their analysis proves prophetic when you examine current statistics, showing over 1.2 million people locked in state and federal prisons, with another 600,000 held in local jails awaiting trial or serving short sentences. The racial composition of prison populations validates every warning the Panthers issued about systematic imprisonment targeting Black communities. Black people now represent 37% of all incarcerated individuals despite comprising only 13% of the general population. This overrepresentation has remained consistent for decades regardless of crime rates or reform efforts. White imprisonment rates hover around 272 per 100,000, while Black imprisonment rates reach 1,240 per 100,000. The Sentencing Project calculates that 1 in 5 Black men born in 2001 faces imprisonment at some point during their lifetime compared to 1 in 17 white men. Private prison companies generate billions in revenue from the mass incarceration the Panthers opposed as economic exploitation of captive populations. CoreCivic and GEO Group operate facilities across 19 states and generated over $4 billion in 2024 through contracts that guarantee minimum occupancy rates. These companies lobby for longer sentences and oppose criminal justice reforms that would reduce their customer base. Their stock prices fluctuate based on incarceration projections and policy changes that affect prison populations. The profit motive creates institutional incentives to maintain high imprisonment rates regardless of public safety outcomes or rehabilitation effectiveness. Drug war policies specifically devastated communities, where Panthers organized most actively during the 1960s and early 1970s. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established mandatory minimum sentences that disproportionately affected Black drug users and sellers. Federal sentencing data shows that average drug sentences for Black defendants increased from 11% longer than white sentences before the act to 49% longer afterward. These policies targeted crack cocaine, prevalent in Black neighborhoods, with sentences 100 times harsher than powder cocaine penalties that affected primarily white users. Oakland, where the Panthers originated, experienced devastating impacts from drug war enforcement that destroyed families and community institutions the party had worked to strengthen. Police arrested thousands of residents for low-level drug offenses that carried mandatory prison terms. Federal prosecutors used conspiracy laws to charge entire families and friendship networks based on minimal evidence of drug activity. The resulting imprisonment removed breadwinners, community leaders, and young adults who might have contributed to neighborhood stability and economic development. Prison labor continues the economic exploitation Panthers identified as central to American capitalism and racial oppression. UNICOR, the Federal Prison Industries Program, generates over $500 million annually through contracts with government agencies that require them to purchase prison-made products using tax-supported inmate labor. Incarcerated workers earn between 20 cents and $1 per hour under conditions that would violate labor laws in any other context. The 13th Amendment explicitly permits slavery for people convicted of crimes, creating a legal framework for exploitation that the Panthers recognized as intentional rather than accidental. Electronic monitoring and probation systems extend carceral control into communities using technology that would have amazed the Panthers who worried about government surveillance in their neighborhoods. Over 4.5 million people live under community supervision through probation and parole systems that monitor their movements, employment, and social relationships. Electronic ankle monitors track location data continuously and can detect alcohol consumption through skin sensors. Violation of supervision terms results in immediate imprisonment without trial or additional charges. Probation officers conduct home searches, drug tests, and employment verification visits that maintain constant surveillance over people who have completed their sentences. The supervision often lasts years longer than original prison terms and includes fees that create additional financial burdens for people trying to rebuild their lives. Technical violations like missing appointments or failing drug tests account for significant portions of prison admissions in many states. These systems create a pipeline back to prison that maintains high incarceration rates without requiring new criminal activity. Cash bail systems perpetuate the class-based injustice Panthers criticized when they demanded freedom for political prisoners who couldn't afford legal representation. Approximately 450,000 people sit in local jails awaiting trial because they cannot pay bail amounts that average $10,000 for felony charges and $1,500 for misdemeanors. These pretrial detainees often lose jobs, housing, and custody of children while waiting months or years for court dates. Many plead guilty to charges they might have contested if they remained free during proceedings. Prison conditions today match or exceed the brutality Panthers documented during their visits to political prisoners in the 1960s and early 1970s. Solitary confinement affects over 80,000 people daily in conditions that United Nations experts classify as torture when extended beyond 15 days. Many prisoners spend decades in isolation cells measuring 6 by 9 feet with minimal human contact or environmental stimulation. Medical neglect causes preventable deaths in facilities where healthcare contracts prioritize cost savings over patient care. The Panthers called for freeing all political prisoners when American prisons held fewer than 400,000 people total. Their demand seems prescient given current incarceration rates with disproportionate representation of activists, organizers, and people whose primary crime was opposing government policies. Leonard Peltier, Mumia Abu-Jamal, and other political prisoners remain incarcerated decades after convictions that relied on suppressed evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. Their continued imprisonment demonstrates the state's use of criminal justice systems to neutralize political opposition rather than promote public safety. Contemporary criminal justice reform movements echo Panther demands for prisoner releases and fundamental system changes rather than minor policy adjustments. Organizations like Critical Resistance and the Movement Strategy Center explicitly reference Panther analysis about prisons serving as tools of social control that require abolition rather than reform. These groups understand that mass incarceration represents intentional policy choices rather than natural responses to crime rates, validating the Panthers' analysis about systematic oppression through imprisonment. But the Panthers understood that controlling where people could live represented an even more fundamental form of social control than imprisonment. Their housing demands addressed discrimination that operated through individual prejudice and informal networks that would eventually evolve into algorithmic systems capable of perpetuating segregation at unprecedented scale. Housing discrimination gets a tech upgrade. The Panthers fought housing discrimination when landlords could openly refuse to rent to black families, and real estate agents steered buyers away from white neighborhoods through personal prejudice and informal agreements. Modern housing discrimination operates through algorithmic systems that achieve the same exclusionary results without requiring conscious bias from any individual participant. Facebook's advertising platform allows landlords to exclude users from seeing rental listings based on zip code, age, and interests that correlate strongly with race and family status. The system enables discrimination at massive scale while providing plausible deniability because the algorithms never explicitly mention race as a targeting criterion. Residential segregation levels today exceed what the Panthers faced when they organized in Oakland, Chicago, and New York during the late 1960s. The Brookings Institution's analysis of 2020 census data shows that 81% of metropolitan areas became more segregated between 2009 and 2020 despite fair housing laws that have been in effect for over 50 years. Cities like Milwaukee, Detroit, and Cleveland maintain segregation indices above 70%, meaning that more than 70% of black residents would need to move to different neighborhoods to achieve racial integration. These numbers represent higher segregation levels than existed in many cities when the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. Gentrification operates as a more sophisticated version of urban renewal programs that destroyed black neighborhoods during the 1960s when the Panthers organized their first community programs. Cities now use tax incentives, zoning changes, and infrastructure investment to attract higher-income residents to historically black areas without the political controversy that surrounded bulldozer urban renewal. The process appears market-driven rather than government-imposed, but achieves identical displacement outcomes for longtime residents who cannot afford rising rents and property taxes. San Francisco's Mission District lost 58% of its Latino population between 2000 and 2020 through gentrification that operated through private investment rather than government programs. Washington, D.C. provides the most dramatic example of displacement through gentrification policies that mirror urban renewal outcomes the Panthers opposed. The city lost over 185,000 black residents between 2000 and 2020, while gaining approximately 120,000 white residents during the same period. Median home prices increased from $280,000 in 2000 to over $700,000 in 2020, making homeownership impossible for families whose incomes remain stagnant. The displacement occurred through market mechanisms rather than explicit government action, but achieved systematic racial removal that exceeds what urban renewal accomplished during the 1960s. Housing affordability has reached crisis levels that validate the Panthers' demands for community land control as an alternative to private real estate markets. Median rent consumes over 50% of median black family income in major cities where Panthers once organized. First-time homebuyer programs remain inaccessible to most black families because median home prices require incomes that exceed what most households earn. The National Association of Realtors found that black applicants face mortgage denial rates twice as high as white applicants, even when controlling for income, debt, and credit scores. Homeownership rates demonstrate the persistent failure of fair housing enforcement and market-based solutions to address racial inequality. White households remain 1.8 times more likely to own their homes compared to black households, a gap that has widened since the Panthers called for housing justice during the early 1970s. The median home equity for white households reached $240,000 in 2020 compared to $40,000 for black homeowners, creating wealth disparities that compound across generations. These statistics prove that individual access to homeownership cannot address systematic exclusion from wealth-building opportunities that homeownership provides. Modern redlining operates through credit scoring algorithms and insurance pricing systems that achieve geographic discrimination without explicitly considering race or location. Credit scoring companies use data about shopping patterns, utility payments, and social media connections to assign scores that correlate strongly with race and neighborhood characteristics. Insurance companies charge higher premiums for identical coverage in zip codes that correspond to historical redlining maps from the 1930s. These systems perpetuate exclusion through automated decision-making that operates continuously without requiring conscious discrimination from individual agents or loan officers. Airbnb and similar short-term rental platforms accelerate displacement in historically black neighborhoods by converting residential units to tourist accommodations that generate higher profits than long-term rentals. Property owners can earn 3 to 5 times more revenue through nightly rentals compared to monthly leases, creating financial incentives to remove units from the housing stock available to permanent residents. Cities like New Orleans, Oakland, and Brooklyn have lost thousands of affordable rental units to short-term rental conversion in neighborhoods where Panthers once organized community programs. Corporate ownership of single-family homes represents a new form of the slumlord exploitation Panthers criticized when they demanded community control over housing. Investment firms like Blackstone, American Homes for Rent, and Invitation Homes own over 400,000 single-family rental properties concentrated in neighborhoods with large Black populations. These companies purchase homes with cash offers that exceed what families can afford, removing homeownership opportunities while converting ownership housing to permanent rentals. The firms often neglect property maintenance while charging rents that exceed mortgage payments families would face if they could access homeownership. Housing segregation has increased in cities the Panthers considered most important for their organizing efforts, including Oakland, Chicago, Detroit, and Milwaukee. The segregation operates through private market mechanisms that achieve outcomes more comprehensive than legal segregation ever accomplished. Algorithmic systems now sort people into neighborhoods based on income, credit scores, and behavioral predictions that correlate with race while avoiding explicit racial classifications. The Panthers understood that housing discrimination required systematic solutions that addressed private market failures rather than individual prejudice alone. Their demands for community land control anticipated current problems with corporate ownership and algorithmic discrimination that operate beyond the reach of fair housing laws designed for individual acts of prejudice. But housing represented just one front in their broader strategy of building power across communities that faced similar economic exploitation, regardless of their racial background. The Rainbow Coalition's strategy that modern movements forgot. Fred Hampton understood that revolution required building bridges across communities that the system wanted to keep divided. The 21-year-old Chicago Panther leader created the Rainbow Coalition in 1969 by bringing together the Young Lords, a Puerto Rican organization, the Young Patriots, poor white Appalachian migrants, and the Brown Berets Chicano activists. Hampton recognized that capitalism exploited all working people regardless of race, and he organized around shared economic interests rather than separate identity struggles. The coalition reduced gang violence in Chicago while building political power that terrified law enforcement agencies who preferred communities fighting each other instead of the system oppressing them all. The Panthers built alliances that seem impossible by today's standards of progressive organizing. They worked with white working-class groups like the Young Patriots despite cultural differences, because Hampton understood that material conditions mattered more than symbols or background. The Young Patriots came from uptown Chicago, where poor white families from Appalachia faced police brutality, substandard housing, and economic exploitation identical to what Black families experienced on the South Side. Hampton convinced both groups that their real enemies were landlords, bosses, and politicians, who profited from keeping communities separated and powerless. Contemporary social justice movements operate in silos that limit their political effectiveness and make them vulnerable to divide-and-conquer tactics. Black Lives Matter, immigrant rights organizations, labor unions, and environmental justice groups pursue separate campaigns with minimal coordination despite facing common opponents in corporate power structures and conservative politicians. The movements compete for media attention, foundation funding, and activist participation rather than building unified opposition to systematic oppression. This fragmentation allows powerful interests to defeat movements individually that might succeed if they coordinated their efforts around shared anti-capitalist analysis. Hampton connected local organizing in Chicago to international liberation struggles in Vietnam, Cuba, Algeria, and Palestine. He understood that American capitalism required imperial domination abroad to maintain profits that funded domestic oppression. The Panthers supported Vietnamese independence not from abstract solidarity, but because they recognized that military spending abroad reduced resources available for community programs at home. They opposed imperialism because they understood that racism and capitalism were global systems that required international resistance to defeat effectively. Modern movements struggle to maintain international perspectives despite operating in a more connected world than the Panthers inhabited. Activists organize around domestic police violence while ignoring American military aid to authoritarian governments abroad. They demand economic justice at home while supporting trade policies that exploit workers in other countries. Environmental justice advocates focus on local pollution while opposing international climate agreements. This narrow focus weakens movements by ignoring how global capitalism connects local struggles to international systems of exploitation and oppression. The Panthers used class-based analysis to explain why working people of all races face similar problems despite different cultural experiences and historical backgrounds. They argued that capitalism created artificial divisions between workers to prevent them from recognizing their shared interests in overthrowing a system that exploited everyone except the wealthy elite. This analysis allowed them to build coalitions between communities that had been taught to see each other as competitors for scarce resources, rather than allies against common oppressors. Current organizing strategies emphasize identity differences rather than shared class interests, making coalition building more difficult and less sustainable over time. Movements focus on specific forms of oppression experienced by particular communities rather than connecting those experiences to systematic exploitation that affects multiple groups simultaneously. This approach creates competition between movements for recognition, resources, and political attention, while obscuring the economic relationships that unite working people across racial and cultural boundaries. Anti-capitalist analysis provided the Panthers with a framework for understanding how different forms of oppression connected to each other through economic relationships. They saw racism as a tool capitalism used to divide workers and justify paying black workers less than white workers. They understood sexism as a way to get women's labor for free while paying men wages below what their work produced. They connected housing discrimination to profit maximization by landlords and real estate developers. This systematic analysis allowed them to build coalitions around shared economic interests while respecting cultural differences between communities. The Panthers criticized liberal reformism for treating symptoms of systematic oppression rather than addressing underlying causes rooted in capitalist economic relationships. They argued that civil rights legislation and anti-poverty programs would fail because they left power structures intact while providing minimal benefits to oppressed communities. Their analysis proves accurate given current conditions, where legal equality coexists with massive racial wealth gaps and continued police violence. Liberal reforms created illusions of progress while maintaining fundamental relationships that produce inequality and oppression. Hampton's internationalist perspective connected domestic organizing to global liberation movements in ways that strengthened both local and international struggles. The Panthers supported Vietnamese independence, Palestinian liberation, and African decolonization because they understood American capitalism as a global system that oppressed working people everywhere. They saw their struggle against police brutality in Oakland as connected to resistance against American-supported dictatorships in Latin America and military interventions in Southeast Asia. This analysis helped them build solidarity with international movements while explaining to local communities how global capitalism affected their daily lives. The Rainbow Coalition model offers solutions to progressive movement fragmentation that limits political effectiveness in contemporary organizing. Hampton's approach focused on shared economic interests that unite working people while respecting cultural differences that reflect distinct historical experiences and community traditions. Coalition building requires analysis that connects different struggles to common underlying causes, rather than simply asking movements to support each other's separate campaigns. The Panthers succeeded because they explained how landlord exploitation, police violence, educational underfunding, and workplace discrimination all serve the same capitalist system that benefited wealthy elites at the expense of working communities. Hampton demonstrated that revolutionary organizing required both uncompromising opposition to systematic oppression and flexible tactics that brought together communities with different experiences and perspectives. He built coalitions around shared material interests while acknowledging cultural differences that reflected distinct histories of struggle and resistance. But the Rainbow Coalition's success depended on leadership that understood how to navigate both revolutionary politics and practical organizing challenges. Leadership that came from sources the historical record has systematically overlooked and undervalued. Women leaders the history books erased. Kathleen Cleaver coordinated media strategy across dozens of cities, while serving as the party's first female Central Committee member and communications secretary. Elaine Brown led the entire organization as national chairwoman from 1974 to 1977, directing community programs and representing the Panthers in negotiations with government officials during some of its most challenging years. Erica Huggins transformed the Oakland Community School into a model educational institution that influenced progressive pedagogy nationwide from 1973 to 1981. These women provided the organizational skills, political analysis, and community connections that sustained programs serving thousands of people across dozens of cities. Women made up approximately half of all Black Panther Party membership, yet most people can name only a handful of male leaders like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. This erasure represents one of the most significant distortions in how we understand the organization's actual structure and effectiveness. The party operated through women's labor at every level from local chapters to national decision-making bodies. Yet historical narratives consistently minimized their contributions while emphasizing male leadership and militant imagery. Brown's leadership coincided with the party's transition from revolutionary rhetoric to electoral politics and community service programs that served thousands of families daily. She understood that sustainable change required building institutions that could survive government repression and internal conflicts that destroyed many radical organizations during the 1970s. Her approach focused on creating lasting community infrastructure rather than pursuing confrontational tactics that generated media attention, but failed to build long-term power. Huggins directed the Oakland Community School with curriculum that integrated academic subjects, cultural education, and political consciousness. Students learned mathematics, science, and literature alongside African history, community organizing, and critical thinking skills that prepared them to understand and challenge systematic oppression. The school's success attracted attention from educators across the country who visited Oakland to observe teaching methods that produced academic achievement while building students' political awareness. These women developed organizing methods around what we now call intersectional issues, decades before academic feminists coined the term to describe how racism and sexism interact to create distinct forms of oppression. They understood that community programs needed to address women's specific needs, including childcare, healthcare, and protection from domestic violence, while building broader movements for social change. Their approach recognized that effective organizing required addressing practical barriers that prevented women's full participation in political activity. The Panthers operated extensive childcare programs that recognized care work as essential political activity rather than private responsibility that limited women's participation in organizing. Free breakfast programs, after-school tutoring, and community schools provided services that allowed women to attend meetings, participate in demonstrations, and take leadership roles without abandoning their children. These programs understood childcare as community responsibility that required collective solutions rather than individual arrangements that isolated women from political activity. Modern discussions about care work and reproductive justice echo arguments Panther women made about connecting personal needs to political organizing. They insisted that movements address practical barriers including access to healthcare, protection from violence, and economic support for families. Contemporary reproductive justice organizing adopts identical approaches by connecting abortion access to broader issues including healthcare, economic inequality, and state violence that affect women's ability to make decisions about their bodies and families. Panther women criticized both racism in feminist movements and sexism within Black liberation organizations, developing analysis that anticipated contemporary intersectional organizing by decades. They refused to choose between fighting racism and fighting sexism because they experienced both forms of oppression simultaneously in ways that required integrated political responses. Their criticism challenged feminist organizations that ignored racism, while demanding that Black liberation movements address sexism as seriously as they addressed racial oppression. The party struggled with gender inequality despite women's central roles in its operations and leadership. Male members often received more recognition for identical work and dominated public speaking roles at events and media interviews. Women fought these patterns by demanding equal treatment within the organization while maintaining focus on broader struggles against capitalism and white supremacy. Their approach offers lessons for contemporary movements that face similar tensions between addressing internal dynamics and maintaining unity against external opponents. Panther women balanced family responsibilities with revolutionary activism through community support systems that shared domestic labor and childcare duties. They organized households, managed children collectively, and created extended family networks that allowed individual women to participate in political activity without neglecting their families. This approach recognized that revolutionary movements required reorganizing social relationships rather than simply adding political activity to existing family structures that already overburdened women with unpaid labor. Their community health work anticipated current discussions about reproductive justice by connecting healthcare access to broader struggles for community control and economic equality. Panther health clinics provided gynecological care, prenatal services, and health education that addressed women's specific medical needs, while building political consciousness about how poverty and racism affected community health. The clinics operated with understanding that healthcare represented a political issue that required organized resistance rather than individual solutions through private medical markets. Women in the party used media and communications in ways that prefigure modern activist strategies, including visual propaganda techniques and strategic messaging. Cleaver appeared on television programs and spoke at universities to explain party positions and counter government disinformation campaigns. She understood that media representation required strategic communication that reached different audiences through various platforms and messaging approaches. Her work established templates for media engagement that contemporary activists use when building public support for their campaigns. The party's newspaper featured articles by women writers who connected local organizing to broader political analysis while explaining complex concepts in language accessible to working-class readers. These women understood that effective communication required translating theoretical ideas into practical terms that helped readers understand how systematic oppression affected their daily lives. Their writing influenced generations of activists who learned to communicate political ideas through personal stories and concrete examples rather than abstract theoretical language. Understanding women's contributions completely changes how we evaluate the Panthers' effectiveness and lasting influence on contemporary movements. Their leadership created institutional stability that allowed the party to operate complex programs including schools, health clinics, and feeding programs through government repression and internal conflicts. Modern activists who study their strategies discover approaches to movement building that address practical concerns while building power for systematic change. But these women understood something that made government surveillance even more intensive than their domestic organizing warranted. They recognized that their struggle against oppression in American cities connected to liberation movements, fighting similar battles across continents and oceans. International connections that terrified the government. The FBI assigned agents specifically to monitor these global relationships and track party communications with revolutionary governments in Cuba, Algeria, China, and North Vietnam. The Panthers established formal alliances that included sharing resources, coordinating media campaigns, and providing mutual support for organizing efforts that extended far beyond American borders. They opened an international headquarters in Algiers between 1969 and 1970 that served as a coordination center for global revolutionary activities and a refuge for members fleeing government persecution in the United States. COINTELPRO launched in August 1967 with specific focus on disrupting the Panthers' international connections, which intelligence agencies viewed as existential threats to American imperial power. Today, laws like FISA allow far broader digital eavesdropping that makes the Bureau's 1960s surveillance operations seem primitive by comparison. Government documents reveal the extent of official paranoia about Panther international activities, including intercepted mail between party members and foreign allies, surveillance of diplomats who met with Panther leaders, and monitoring of Americans who attended international conferences or visited countries supporting liberation movements. Eldridge Cleaver established the international section in Algiers with support from the Algerian government that provided office space, communications equipment, and diplomatic protection for Panther members living in exile. The Algerian headquarters coordinated solidarity campaigns for political prisoners, organized international speaking tour for party leaders, and facilitated connections between American activists and liberation movements worldwide. Cleaver used the platform to address United Nations sessions about human rights violations in the United States, while building relationships with representatives from newly independent African nations, who shared analysis about connections between domestic racism and global colonialism. The party's anti-imperialist analysis connected American military interventions abroad to police violence against black communities at home. They argued that the same government that bombed Vietnamese villages also brutalized black neighborhoods through police occupation and economic exploitation. Panthers opposed the Vietnam War not from pacifist principles, but because they understood that military spending abroad reduced resources available for community programs while training soldiers in violence techniques later used against domestic populations. Their international perspective helped explain how American capitalism required imperial domination to maintain profits that funded domestic oppression. Contemporary movements opposing American military interventions continue using analysis the Panthers developed during the 1960s and early 1970s. Organizations like Code Pink, Veterans for Peace, and the Answer Coalition connect current wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria to domestic issues including police violence, economic inequality, and environmental destruction. These groups understand that military spending depletes resources needed for healthcare, education, and infrastructure, while militarizing police departments that use battlefield tactics against civilian populations. The connections mirror Panther arguments about how imperialism abroad enabled oppression at home. Palestinian solidarity movements explicitly reference Panther international analysis when connecting struggles against Israeli occupation to resistance against police violence in American cities. Organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace use Panther frameworks to explain how American military aid supports occupation abroad while funding police militarization at home. The movements understand that Israeli surveillance technology tested on Palestinians gets exported to American police departments for use against Black communities. This analysis continues Panther traditions of connecting domestic and international liberation struggles through shared opposition to American imperial power. Panthers used international law frameworks including the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights to challenge American government authority and expose contradictions between official rhetoric about democracy and actual treatment of Black communities. They petitioned the United Nations to investigate human rights violations including police brutality, inadequate healthcare, and educational discrimination that violated international standards America claimed to uphold. The strategy attempted to internationalize domestic civil rights struggles by appealing to global institutions that could pressure the American government to address systematic oppression. Revolutionary governments in Cuba and Algeria provided material support for Panther programs, including funding for community schools and health clinics that served thousands of families across American cities. The international assistance enabled Panthers to operate programs that demonstrated alternatives to government social services while building community power and political consciousness. Foreign support proved that international solidarity could provide practical resources for domestic organizing, rather than simply symbolic encouragement for liberation struggles. The party influenced other American liberation movements by demonstrating how international perspective strengthened domestic organizing efforts. The Young Lords, American Indian Movement, and Chicano organizations adopted Panther international analysis while building their own relationships with global liberation struggles. These movements understood that their specific experiences with oppression connected to broader patterns of colonialism and imperialism that required international resistance. The Panthers provided frameworks for understanding how domestic racism operated as part of global systems that exploited working people worldwide. Third World solidarity became central to Panther political analysis as they connected struggles of Black Americans to independence movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They understood American racism as a form of internal colonialism that used similar techniques of control and exploitation that characterized European colonialism abroad. This analysis helped explain how corporate interests profited from both domestic oppression and international exploitation, while using racism to divide working people who might otherwise unite against their common oppressors. The government's extreme reaction to Panther international connections reveals how seriously officials took the threat of global solidarity among oppressed peoples. Intelligence agencies understood that international support could provide resources, legitimacy, and strategic coordination that would strengthen domestic resistance movements beyond what they could achieve through isolated organizing. The systematic surveillance and disruption of international activities demonstrated government recognition that global liberation movements posed fundamental challenges to American imperial power, both domestically and internationally. Modern anti-imperialist movements that oppose American military interventions, support Palestinian liberation, and organize against corporate globalization continue using analytical frameworks the Panthers developed through their international solidarity work. These movements understand that domestic and international liberation struggles face common opponents in multinational corporations, military institutions, and government agencies that benefit from maintaining oppressive relationships worldwide. But the Panthers' influence extends far beyond their international analysis into organizing methods that shape contemporary activism in ways most participants never recognize. The revolutionary legacy that lives on. Today's activists employ organizing strategies the Panthers developed during the late 1960s without recognizing the historical connections. Black Lives Matter chapters organize rapid response networks for police violence incidents using communication methods identical to Panther alert systems from 50 years earlier. Community defense groups that emerged during 2020 uprisings adopted patrol structures, conflict de-escalation training, and mutual aid coordination that mirror Panther community self-defense programs. Modern organizers create survival programs including food distribution, eviction defense, and jail support using operational frameworks the Panthers established when they launched their breakfast programs and legal aid services. Former Panther members established community organizations during the 1980s and 1990s that trained current activists including leaders of Black Lives Matter, Critical Resistance, and the Movement Strategy Center. These relationships created knowledge transmission systems that preserved Panther organizing methods through periods when radical politics faced intense repression and public hostility. The direct lineage explains why contemporary movements adopt identical tactical approaches to community organizing, political education, and institutional building without conscious awareness of their historical origins. Political education programs operating in cities across America use curricula and teaching methods directly adapted from Panther educational initiatives. Liberation schools in Oakland, Freedom schools in Mississippi, and Popular Education Project workshops nationwide employ reading lists, discussion formats, and community analysis techniques the Panthers pioneered through their political education classes. Contemporary programs combine study of revolutionary theory with practical organizing skills, including meeting facilitation, campaign planning, and media strategy, using integrated approaches the Panthers developed when they recognized that sustainable movements required both theoretical understanding and tactical proficiency. Community self-defense initiatives that emerged during recent social movements explicitly reference Panther philosophy about protecting communities from state violence through organized collective action rather than relying on individual armed resistance. Copwatch programs, legal observers, and community mediation projects operate under principles the Panthers established when they argued that community safety required community control rather than dependence on police protection that never materialized for oppressed populations. Modern self-defense encompasses broader concepts including economic defense through mutual aid, digital security training, and community healing practices that address trauma caused by systematic violence. Contemporary economic justice movements adopt Panther critique of capitalism as a system that requires inequality and oppression to function effectively for wealthy elites. Organizations like the Poor People's Campaign, National Domestic Workers Alliance, and Fight for 15 use anti-capitalist analysis when explaining how corporate power creates conditions requiring workers to accept poverty wages, dangerous working conditions, and job insecurity. These movements understand that reforms within capitalist frameworks cannot address fundamental relationships that produce wealth concentration while maintaining mass poverty and economic exploitation. Occupy Wall Street, Fight for 15, and similar economic justice campaigns borrowed Panther media strategies including visual propaganda, strategic messaging, and community-controlled communications that bypass mainstream media filters. Contemporary activists use social media platforms to distribute information directly to supporters using techniques that parallel Panther newspaper production and distribution systems. Modern movements understand that controlling narrative requires independent media infrastructure capable of reaching mass audiences, while countering corporate propaganda designed to undermine organizing efforts. The integration of service provision with political organizing continues through contemporary movements that provide immediate community support while building power for systematic change. Mutual aid networks that emerged during COVID-19 lockdowns operated through churches, community centers, and informal networks that replicated Panther organizational structures down to specific details like volunteer coordination and resource distribution methods. Community land trusts, worker cooperatives, and alternative economic institutions operating across American cities continue Panther experiments with community control over resources and decision-making processes that challenge capitalist relationships directly. The Panthers demonstrated that ordinary people could build alternative institutions capable of serving thousands of community members while maintaining revolutionary vision and political analysis. Their schools, health clinics, and feeding programs proved that communities possessed resources and skills necessary for meeting their own needs without dependence on government agencies or private charities that maintained oppressive relationships while providing minimal assistance. Contemporary movements reference this legacy when arguing that communities can organize cooperative economics, community-controlled education, and alternative safety systems that address root causes rather than symptoms of systematic problems. Current discussions about reform versus revolution echo debates the Panthers engaged during their transition from revolutionary rhetoric to electoral politics and community service programs. Contemporary movements face similar tensions between working within existing political systems to achieve immediate improvements and building alternative institutions that challenge capitalist relationships directly. Organizations like Democratic Socialists of America, Movement Strategy Center, and various municipal candidates grapple with questions about whether electoral participation strengthens or undermines revolutionary potential that the Panthers debated internally during the 1970s. The Panthers proved that revolutionary movements could operate effectively despite intense government repression and internal conflicts that destroyed many radical organizations during the same period. Their ability to maintain programs serving thousands of people while facing FBI surveillance, police harassment, and media attacks provides lessons for contemporary movements operating under similar pressures. Modern activists study Panther security practices, organizational structures, and strategic approaches when building movements capable of surviving external attacks and internal disagreements that threaten movement continuity and effectiveness. But understanding their legacy requires examining whether their original demands from 1966 adequately address the scale of problems that have emerged over the past 60 years. The data reveals conditions that would have shocked even the Panthers' most radical members and suggests their 10-point program may have been too modest for what American society actually requires. The Panthers' organizing methods offer 3 core lessons that remain essential for contemporary movements. Their community programs demonstrated that grassroots organizations could provide services more effectively than government agencies while building political consciousness simultaneously. Their community self-defense philosophy showed that safety requires collective organization rather than dependence on police protection that never materialized for oppressed populations. Their anti-capitalist analysis connected different forms of oppression to economic relationships that exploit working people regardless of race or background. When you examine current data against their 1966 demands, their 10-point program looks moderate compared to what conditions actually require. They demanded decent housing when homeownership gaps were narrower than today. They called for community control when corporate consolidation was less extreme. They opposed police violence when departments killed fewer people annually and lacked military equipment. The wealth gap has tripled since they organized. Mass incarceration exploded beyond their warnings. Surveillance capabilities exceed their most paranoid predictions. Consider what free breakfast programs or community land trusts might look like in your city.